My name is Evelyn. I am 52 years old and I am staring at the blood-stained hands of the man who just pulled me from the burning wreckage of my car. The rain is pouring down in heavy sheets, washing the mud and ash from his weathered face, and my heart completely stops when I recognize those deep, kind eyes. It is Thomas, the loyal gardener I ruthlessly fired and humiliated exactly 10 years ago over a mistake he never made. The metallic smell of my crushed vehicle mixes with the scent of wet pine, and a profound wave of shame paralyzes my body. I am bleeding heavily on the side of a desolate highway, entirely at the mercy of the human being I once tossed aside like garbage. He presses his thick jacket against my open wound, his face showing absolutely no malice, and I wept as he to understand the absolute gravity of this moment, I need to take you back a decade. 10 years ago, I was a very different woman. I was living in a massive estate in the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut, drowning in the bitterness of a terrible divorce. My focus was entirely on appearances, maintaining a facade of perfection while my personal life crumbled. I had a staff to manage the property, but the only person who brought life to that estate was Thomas. Thomas was a gentle, soft-spoken man of 55 years old who treated every plant in my garden as if it were his own child. He worked from dawn until dusk, always with a quiet smile, even when I barked unreasonable orders at him. Thomas had been working for my family for over 7 years, serving as the silent guardian of my sanctuary, but my heart was so heartened by my own misery that I completely failed to see his humanity. I never bothered to ask him about his personal life or the fact that his wife was battling a severe illness. I was wrapped up in my own bubble of privilege. The night on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, I was preparing for a charity gala and went to my heavy mahogany jewelry box to retrieve my grandmother's vintage diamond brooch. When I opened the velvet drawer, my stomach dropped. The brooch was gone. I tore the room apart, my panic quickly mutating into a blind, irrational rage. I immediately called my older sister, Sarah, who is 54 years old today. Sarah was my absolute opposite, calm, rational, and deeply empathetic. She rushed over to help me search, gently suggesting I probably misplaced it, but I was beyond the point of reason. I needed someone to blame for the lack of control I felt over my miserable life. I looked out the window and saw Thomas. He was inside the house earlier that morning to fix a leaking indoor fountain. It was a flimsy connection, but in my paranoid mind, it was undeniable proof. I convinced myself he had stolen my heirloom. Sarah pleaded with me to think logically, warning me that accusing an innocent man could ruin his life forever, but I fiercely refused to listen. I marched out into the garden, my high heels sinking into the soft soil, my face twisted in fury. Thomas looked up from the rose bushes, giving me his usual warm, polite smile. I did not even give him a chance to speak. I screamed at him. I demanded he return the brooch immediately, threatening to call the police and have him thrown in a cold prison cell. The look of utter confusion and terror that washed over his face is something that still haunts my nightmares. He dropped his trowel, his hand shaking violently as he took a step back from my verbal assault. He began to plead with me, his voice cracking with genuine desperation. He swore on his life that he had never taken anything. With tears forming in his eyes, he finally revealed his personal burden. He told me his wife was incredibly sick, that he desperately needed this job to pay for her life-saving medications, and that being fired would destroy his family. He begged me to search his pockets and his truck, but I was a monster made of cold stone. I told him he was a disgusting liar and fired him right there on the spot, demanding he leave the property within 5 minutes. I watched from the warmth of my kitchen as Thomas packed his modest tools into his rusty pickup truck. The sky had turned a dark purple and a freezing rain began to fall, soaking him to the bone. He looked back at the house one last time, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, before driving away into the miserable weather. I felt a brief pang of guilt in my chest, a whisper of conscience telling me I had made a terrible mistake, but my fragile ego quickly crushed that feeling. I convinced myself I was the victim, protecting my home from a deceitful thief. Exactly 3 weeks later, the truth shattered my entire world. I was preparing to move out of the estate, having finalized the sale following my divorce. The movers were disassembling my heavy oak bed frame when I heard a small metallic clink hit the hardwood floor. I walked over, looking down near the baseboard, and my breath hitched in my throat. There, covered in a thick layer of dust, was my grandmother's diamond brooch. It must have slipped off my dress weeks ago, tumbling down the narrow gap behind the headboard. It was never stolen. It was right there the entire time. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the floor, clutching the cold metal tightly in my trembling palm. I let out a loud, agonizing sob as the full weight of my horrific actions crashed down upon my shoulders. I had destroyed an innocent man. I had ripped away his livelihood, his dignity, and his ability to care for his dying wife, all because I was too arrogant to look behind a piece of furniture. The guilt was a physical pain, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest that made it impossible to breathe. I immediately called Sarah, crying hysterically into the phone, confessing what I had found. She came over right away, and together we formulated a plan to find Thomas. I was ready to give him his job back, to pay for his wife's medical bills, anything to erase this terrible stain on my soul. I hired a private investigator, tracking his address to a modest apartment complex across town. I drove there the very next morning, my heart pounding, but I was too late. The landlord told me they had been evicted 2 weeks prior and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. They were gone. The next 10 years were a slow, painful journey of personal transformation. That horrific mistake completely broke my ego and fundamentally changed who I was. I moved into a much smaller, modest home. I started volunteering at local shelters, desperately trying to put some good back into a world I had polluted with my cruelty. I became a softer, more patient person. But the ghost of Thomas never left my side. Every time I saw a beautiful garden, I thought of the man I had unjustly ruined. I carried that heavy guilt like a chain around my neck, an invisible prison of my own making.
That brings us to today. I was driving back from a weekend retreat in the mountains, navigating a notoriously treacherous road known as Devil's Curve. The weather had turned violent very suddenly. A massive thunderstorm rolled over the peaks, dumping sheets of blinding rain and turning the asphalt into a slick, deadly mirror. As I rounded a sharp bend, a large deer leaped directly into the middle of the dark road. I panicked, slamming my foot hard onto the brake pedal and turning the steering wheel violently to the right. My heavy SUV lost all traction immediately, plunging off the road. The world spun in a terrifying blur as the vehicle breached the guardrail and plummeted down the steep, muddy embankment. The sound was deafening, the horrific crunch of metal folding, the shattering of glass, the explosive deployment of the airbags hitting my face like a concrete wall. The car rolled over twice before slamming sideways into the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree. I woke up trapped upside down. My right leg was crushed under the collapsed dashboard, and a large, jagged piece of metal had sliced deeply into my side. Flames were beginning to lick the edges of the hood. Just as the edges of my vision began to darken, I heard the sound of heavy boots rushing down the muddy embankment. A dark silhouette appeared outside my shattered window. A man was desperately pulling at the deformed door handle, his muscles straining against the mangled steel. He grabbed a heavy rock from the mud, smashed the remaining shards of the window, and reached inside to slice through my jammed seatbelt with a pocket knife. He dragged my broken body out of the burning metal cage just seconds before a massive explosion of fire consumed the entire front half of the vehicle. He crawled over to me urgently, shrugging off his heavy waterproof coat and pressing it hard against the deep wound on my side. "Stay with me. Keep your eyes open. Help is coming," he said, his voice deep and incredibly soothing. I blinked through the heavy rain and forced my eyes to focus on my savior's face. The lines of age had deepened, his hair had turned snowy white, but I recognized those kind, sorrowful eyes. It was Thomas. He was now 65 years old. The shock hit me harder than the crash. I gasped, trembling violently. He realized he was saving the life of the woman who destroyed his. Instead of walking away, his grip tightened. He leaned closer to protect my face from the pelting rain, his expression completely devoid of any resentment. There was only pure compassion. "I have got you, Miss Evelyn. You are going to be just fine," he whispered softly. "You are going to be just fine." The absolute purity of his forgiveness broke something deep inside my soul. I grabbed his rough wrist, the agonizing guilt of 10 years erupting from my chest, and I wept as he held me together. The ambulance arrived shortly after. I was rushed to the hospital and immediately taken into emergency surgery to save my life. When I finally woke up in the sterile recovery room 2 days later, Sarah was sitting by my bed, holding my hand and crying softly. But she was not alone. Sitting quietly in the corner chair, holding a faded baseball cap, was Thomas. He had stayed in the waiting room for 2 entire days just to make sure I survived. I asked Sarah to give us a moment alone. The room was heavy with a silence that spanned 10 long years. I looked at Thomas, tears streaming through my bruised face, and I finally confessed everything. I told him about finding the brooch and the endless guilt I carried.
Thomas listened quietly, his kind eyes never leaving my face. When I finished begging him for forgiveness I absolutely did not deserve, he simply nodded. He told me the first few years were incredibly hard and that his wife had passed away peacefully 5 years ago. "Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, Miss Evelyn," he said softly. "I forgave you a long time ago. Today, I am just glad I was on that road to pull you out. When I was discharged, I used my savings to buy the local nursery where he worked, transferring the deed to him. Every single day of my life now is dedicated to honoring the second chance that a man I once wronged gave to me in the freezing mud. I learned that redemption is not something you can simply buy. It is a precious gift bestowed upon you by those you have hurt the most, and it requires a lifetime of changed behavior to truly earn. Would you have the immense strength to save the life of someone who completely destroyed yours? Or would you let them face the consequences of their own karma? Think very deeply about the incredible power of your own forgiveness. Until the next story.